Welcome back, everybody. Let's get started. Last class. So today we're going to be talking about pitching first, not baseball, not relative to the playoffs coming up, but no, pitching, the process banks use to sell their services to prospective customers. And then we'll talk about this for probably about an hour. After that, we'll take a quick break, come back, we'll talk about interviewing, recruiting, all that. So if you have questions on recruiting, that would be a good time. As part of that discussion, we'll also be reviewing a lot of the key technical concepts of the class. Banking interviews tend to have a lot of technical interview questions, things like how do you calculate enterprise value. So we'll go through a lot of those items in the context of our recruiting discussion. So that's the roadmap. Today's the last day, as we all know. Again, if you ever need to come back, you always are welcome to. I think I've made that clear a couple times, but feel free, just let me know, let the guys in New York know that you're going to come back, and you can always come. All right, so let's talk about pitching. Like I said before, pitching is the process banks use to go out, offer their services to prospective clients. This is the selling process. This is the marketing process. And most of the time, if you work in an investment bank, if you're an analyst, if you're an associate, you can spend half, sometimes even more than half of your time pitching, the other half of your time on live deals. So today we're going to talk about all the things that go into the pitch process. We'll talk about pitch books. We'll talk about what's contained in pitch books. We'll talk about the analyst and associate's role in that process. But anytime a bank is looking to win business, whether it's to go out and manage an IPO for a company or raise additional capital in the public markets or in the private markets, if they're trying to win business for advisory services like M&A, that type of thing, restructuring, real big right now, or even if banks are pitching for financial opinions business, that is issuing valuation opinions, issuing fairness opinions, that type of thing, there'll be typically a pitch process associated with that, where the bank goes into the client, tells them all about themselves, tells them about what they think valuation might be, et cetera. And just like any other business, obviously, we've got to win business in banking. We got to keep the doors open. We got to pay bonuses, all that. So again, you might spend up to maybe more than half of your time pitching. It's a very important part of banking. Sometimes not the most glamorous part of banking, but an important part nonetheless. All right. And I think I've mentioned before, but banking is a relationship business, just like a lot of other businesses, legal business, et cetera. Banking is a relationship business. And when we talk about a managing director, basically the biggest value he or she brings to the table is their Rolodex, whom they know, how many doors they can open, how much business they can bring to the investment bank. Managing director is largely a rainmaking or marketing role geared at bringing in new clients. All right, so that's what people ultimately aspire to in banking. Managing directors that bring in a lot of business are obviously making a lot of money. They can make 7, 8 figures a year in good years. Not at all uncommon. All right, so a lot of business, as we mentioned, relationship business, a lot of business driven by referrals, past clients. The boutique bank I used to work for a number of years ago in Philadelphia, we got almost all of our business from existing and past clients. We would do just all their investment banking work for them year after year after year. We'd get a lot of referrals from attorneys, especially when attorneys were out soliciting investment banks to write fairness opinions, to write valuation opinions. A lot of that would come to us through that referral channel as well. So managing directors who have spent years and years developing relationships in industry with CEOs, CFOs, boards of directors, et cetera, developing relationships with past clients, lawyers, accountants, et cetera. A lot of business can come in that referral route as well. And a lot of times, especially when banks are working with maybe clients that maybe are a little less sophisticated or maybe a little less in tune with what's going on in the capital markets, banks may actually be proactive in pushing particular transactions. All right, telling CEOs, telling CFOs it might be a good time to think about consolidating. Here are some ideas that we have regarding M&A. Here are some ideas we have regarding some alternatives, et cetera. And a lot of times, as part of the pitching process, analysts and associates will, rather than just putting together pitch books, we'll spend a lot of time researching industries, understanding the dynamics in those industries, understanding whether an industry might be ripe for consolidation, and basically getting all the materials together to be able to help recommend particular transactions to clients. Like we say here, a lot of CEOs are so focused on their business, they're not so focused on what's going on in the capital markets. And this is another place where investment banks can add a lot of value. Now, when we say bake-off, a bake-off is a term to refer to the process where multiple banks come in to a client and pitch their products and services. Bake-off, dog and pony show, whatever you want to call it. That's, again, where banks get the opportunity to come in and pitch, tell the client why they're the best for the job, et cetera. Banks are often invited, one by one. So they'll come in, Goldman Sachs will come in, then Morgan Stanley will come in, then JP Morgan Chase, et cetera. Come in one by one, present, not just what they think the company might be valued at in a particular deal, but also, very importantly, as we'll get to in a moment, talk about the bank itself, why they've got more experience in a particular industry or a particular product type, et cetera. All right, these are, basically this is the culmination of a lot of work by analysts and associates putting these materials together, finally getting in front of the client, pitching and trying to win the business. It can be a very, very stressful process. You can spend weeks and weeks researching an industry, putting together pitch books, running valuation models, et cetera, only to walk away empty-handed. So this is really an important and can often be a very stressful process. It can also be multiple rounds, all right? Not at all unheard of for very large deals. The prospective client might bring in 10 or 15 investment banks. For the first round, cut 5 or 6 of them out, go to a second round, maybe make another cut, go to a third round, kind of like a golf tournament, right? But at the end of the day, that can add to the stress of this process. It gets really tough to kind of think of new things to say at each successive round. So it can be pretty challenging in that respect. All right, but we'll talk a little more about that. We'll talk, obviously, a lot about what goes into these pitch books and the pitch process as well. So when we talk about the pitch book itself, we're talking about the spiral-bound material that gets put in front of a client. And like I said, Ernest brought in a couple pitch books. One was a Merrill pitch book. Another was JP Morgan. He's got a third. So he's going to pass some of those around. I took a look at them. There's some good examples of a typical pitch book, about that thick. Contains a lot of the things we're going to talk about here. Most pitch books, as a table of contents, are going to have something similar to this. We're going to go through each one of these individually, talk about what's contained in each section, but introduction to the bank, qualifications. Usually there'll be an industry overview, a market update, that is what's going on in the capital markets. Talk about the company's specific situation as it's been explained to the bank. Talk about valuation. Obviously, we've spent a lot of time in valuation. It's always an important focal point of any discussion regarding a deal. Oftentimes, they'll talk about the sale or the financing process. If it's an M&A deal, we could have a roadmap or a process timeline very similar to what we talked about yesterday. Here are all the things we're going to do in M&A. And then finally, there'll typically be a buyer or an investor list somewhere in there. So the intro and qualification section, this is always first in the pitch book. This is talking about things like why we're here, right? If we're Goldman Sachs, why are we here today? And most importantly, who are we? What is the team? And what is our expertise in this particular transaction or this particular industry? What deals have we done in, say, the pharmaceutical industry that would qualify us better than any other bank to do this pharmaceutical deal that we're talking about? All right? So this can be one of the very most important aspects of the pitch book. A bank's qualifications alone, managing directors' relationships in a particular industry alone might be enough for them to win the business. Right? So they'll talk about, when we talk about the particular transaction or the particular industry, they'll talk about deals that they've done. Right? If it's M&A, they'll talk about M&A deals. If it's the pharmaceutical industry, they'll talk about M&A deals in the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, if it's a European deal, they'll talk about their experience during doing deals in Europe. All right. They'll also reference something called league tables. Anybody know what a league table is? They're basically rankings. Basically rankings of the investment banks. Who's done the most transactions? Who's done the most transactions in the United States for M&A? Who's done the most for IPOs? Who's been active in Europe? Who's been active in South America? Who's been active in particular industries? There are a number of different league tables out there, And what banks do in this pitch process is typically slice and dice the data to make sure that they're presenting the league table that shows them toward the top. All right, so if it's a European pharmaceutical deal for M&A, it might be a situation where the first bank comes in and says, we're number one in M&A, just period. The next bank might come in and say, well, we're number one in doing pharmaceutical M&A. And then the third bank would come in and say, well, we're number one doing European M&A and pharmaceuticals, all right, that type of thing. So again, banks are slicing and dicing those league tables to present themselves most favorably to the client. Banks might also present tombstones or case studies of deals they've worked on. Again, we talked about tombstones yesterday. There are a couple going around as well. But this precedence in doing deals in a particular industry or having done deals in a particular transaction type can't be understated in terms of their importance. Like I said, a lot of times this is a key reason why banks will win or potentially lose business. Next, or shortly thereafter, there'll typically be an industry overview, basically talking about, number one, the bank's knowledge of a particular space. All right. Again, getting back to how many deals we've done in M&A, in pharmaceuticals, for example. All right. If we're talking about an industry where there are boutique investment banks specifically focused on that industry, you can think of Thomas Wiesel in technology. You can think of Allen & Company in media, et cetera. All right, they're going to be obviously very focused on their expertise. They're going to be the ones that typically will be shortlisted for any bake-off involving technology or media, et cetera. All right, and for certain industries, especially tech, especially financial institutions, this is really a very important factor that the bank understands these industries. There are different dynamics in different industries that drive valuation, drive transaction dynamics in industries. The bank needs to be able to understand those. If a bank has never done a technology deal, it's going to be tough for them to come in and say that, we're going to be the right bank for the deal here. Chances are, the company's going to consider a bank with more technology experience. Right, this is also a section where we talk about what's going on in the industry. What is our understanding of the dynamics here? Okay, if you look at the food industry or the confection industry, we've talked about that Kraft Cadbury deal that's in the news a lot lately. And if we're talking about another food deal, we're probably going to reference, here's the Kraft Cadbury deal, here's what's going on there, here's what we see in terms of ultimately what valuation is going to look like there, what it might mean for your company in the M&A context, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we're asking and hopefully answering the question, is it the right time to be seeking funding, taking the company public, or doing a transaction in this industry? All right, and you can probably imagine that the right answer is not always yes. You can think back to what's happened over the last year in the marketplace. It really hasn't been a good time to do transactions in any industry. Market overview section, again, this is going to be somewhere around where the industry overview section is. This is really where the banker talks about their understanding of what's going on in the capital markets, what's going on with respect to a particular product that we're talking about. So what's happening with M&A? What's happening with IPOs? What's happening with restructuring? Okay, so this is a good time to sell, or maybe let's hold off on an IPO. Probably it's more the latter these days. Let's hold off on that IPO windows. The IPO quote-unquote window right now is starting to open, but probably not the most favorable or receptive environment for new issuance at this point. And obviously, if we've seen where valuation has gone in the last year, timing on particular transactions can be very important as well. All right, so if you go out in a bad M&A environment, it's not at all unusual to see company valuations plunge. Certainly in the last year, we've seen valuation plunge by 50%, recover somewhat, but valuations in certain industries are still pretty down and out, especially those that are really sensitive to the overall economy. Company and situation overview. This is where the banker is demonstrating that they understand what's going on with the company, they understand the situation right now, and that they're going to be able to accomplish the goals of management, the board of directors, really whoever's driving that particular transaction on the company side. All right, and this is really important for boards of directors, management. They need to understand that banks see eye to eye with them. and they want to see exactly how well or maybe how poorly the banker might position whatever the product offering is to the market. All right? Whether it's an IPO positioning or a pitch for an IPO business, whether it's a pitch for M&A, this is where the banker is going to demonstrate their ability to market the offering to the public or to the buyer pool. And a lot of times, if we're an investment bank, we might not get a whole lot of information going into the pitch. If it's a public company, obviously there's a lot of information. We can go to the SEC website, download all the 10Ks, 10Qs, 8Ks, etc. But if we're talking about a private company, we may be very, very limited in terms of the amount of information given to us prior to the pitch. They may only give us financial statements. They may only give us enough so that we can get a rough opinion of valuation, but they may purposely withhold sensitive information at this point in the process. One, because it's sensitive, all right, and two, because maybe they want to test how creative we can be in demonstrating our understanding of the company. So, like we say here, some bake-offs will purposely limit the amount of information distributed to all the banks, and it's up to the banks to get a little more creative in their pitch to demonstrate their knowledge. As we talked about before, valuation is always a focal point of any discussion, especially a pitch. A lot of times when you pass out the pitch books, you see the board or management, whoever's the audience, immediately flipping to valuation because they just want to see what do the numbers look like. Is this bank coming in around where we expect valuation to come in? And typically this is, especially at this early stage, we're not giving specific numbers. We're not coming in saying valuation is, 5.25 billion. Rather, we would say valuation probably 4.75 to 5.5 billion, somewhere in there, right? And then that range, again, would get tightened up as we go through the process, as we learn more information, have a chance to digest that and incorporate that into our analysis. All right. A lot of times, as we've talked about before, pitches are going to rely heavily on what's going on in the market, so comparable companies or trading multiples analyses, precedent transactions, to the extent we have them. And obviously, if we're talking about a potential deal that would involve a controlling interest, we'd want to be speaking in terms of controlling interest. If we're talking about IPO, where it's a minority interest stake being sold, we'd want to talk in terms of minority interest valuations. And that's why we discuss those in the valuation section. DCF, we're always going to do a DCF. We're always going to do it, but a lot of times, as I talked about before, we may not rely upon that as heavily as we would trading multiples or precedent transactions. All right. But it's unusual for a banker to walk into a pitch blind in terms of what the valuation expectation is. Typically what happens is when the MD initially gets that call, to be part of the bake-off, usually the question will be asked at some point, or should be asked at some point, well, Mr. CFO, Mr. CEO, where do you think valuation is coming out? What is the expectation of the board? Because the last thing we want to do is spend weeks and weeks and weeks doing valuation, doing all kinds of analyses, and come in 50% of where the company expects it to be.